The night was heavy with silence, yet the silence was crueler than any noise. The girl sat in the darkness of the clearing where her family and clan had left her, her bare feet pressed into the cold earth, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and night-blooming flowers, but to her, it carried only the bitterness of rejection. She had known ridicule before, the sting of mocking laughter, the sharpness of whispered insults, the weight of being unwanted, but this was different. This was abandonment, a deliberate act of cutting her away from the life she had once known. The footsteps of those who had cast her out had long faded, but their absence echoed louder than their presence ever had. She stared at the horizon where the sun had slipped away, leaving behind only the bruised colors of dusk, and she asked herself over and over what sin she had committed to deserve such cruelty. The shadows of the trees stretched long and twisted, wrapping around her like chains, and she could not shake the feeling that the darkness itself had teeth. Every rustle in the bushes, every call of a night bird, every whisper of wind made her heart pound, not because she feared wild animals, but because she feared the greater predator, loneliness. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharper than any claw, and thirst dried her lips until they cracked. She remembered the look on her stepmother's face when the command was given, remembered the indifference of her father, the way the other villagers had turned their heads away. They had not spoken words of comfort or mercy. Instead, they had looked at her as though she were already gone, already erased from their world. As the night deepened, she curled tighter against herself, but the questions in her heart would not let her rest. Why did cruelty follow her like a shadow? Was she cursed, as some had claimed? Was she born only to suffer? She tried to recall moments of kindness in her life, but they slipped through her memory like water through her fingers, leaving only fragments. A fleeting smile from a stranger, the warmth of a song she once heard, the comfort of dreams she could barely remember. Yet these were fragile things, too weak to stand against the crushing weight of rejection. The moon climbed higher, casting its pale light over the clearing, and in that light, her face looked ghostly, almost unfamiliar. She touched her own skin as though trying to remind herself she was still real, still alive. The ache in her belly, the shiver in her bones, the raw sting of her tears, these were proof that she had not yet disappeared, though her family wished it so. But what life was this, cut away from others, left to starve and die beneath the indifferent gaze of the stars? She tried to sleep, but every time her eyes closed she saw their faces, saw the sneers and the cold glances, saw the moment when they turned their backs. Each vision was like a dagger in her chest, reopening wounds she could not heal. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she pressed her forehead to the ground, whispering words that had no sound, prayers to a sky she was not sure would listen. She did not ask for rescue, only for understanding, only for some reason why cruelty had been chosen as her companion. The hours stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. She counted her heartbeat, listened to the blood rushing in her ears, tried to anchor herself to the present moment, but despair was a tide, and it dragged her under again and again. Still, beneath the suffocating weight, there was something small, a flicker like a coal buried in ash. It was not hope, not yet, but the stubbornness of life itself, the refusal of her body and spirit to surrender completely. She could feel it in the way her lungs still drew breath, in the way her eyes still searched the shadows, in the way her hands, though trembling, still clenched into fists. The night of abandonment was meant to break her, to end her story in silence and obscurity. Yet even as despair consumed her, there was a part of her that refused to vanish. She did not know why cruelty followed her, but she knew that somewhere deep inside, beyond hunger and grief, something else waited, something the darkness had not yet claimed. And as the hours of the night dragged toward dawn, the girl sat alone, her body frail, her spirit bruised, but the ember within her, though hidden, remained unextinguished. The night stretched endlessly, each moment pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. The ground beneath her was hard and unforgiving, the soil damp from the evening dew soaking into her thin clothes, chilling her to the bone. She tried to curl into herself for warmth, but the cold was merciless, creeping into her muscles and joints until even her shivers felt exhausted. Hunger gnawed at her with sharp, relentless teeth, twisting her stomach into knots that made her body ache more than the cold ever could. It had been a day since she had eaten anything substantial, and now the emptiness within her echoed louder than the silence of the night. Fear was another companion, thick, suffocating, invisible. Every rustle in the grass felt like a predator's footstep, every snap of a twig sounded like the approach of death. The darkness was not only around her but inside her, clawing at her spirit as though determined to tear it apart. The villagers believed that this would be her undoing. They thought leaving her alone in the cold and hunger would crush what little strength she had left, would turn her into nothing more than a forgotten memory, a cautionary tale for others. To them, her suffering was not only punishment but spectacle, a cruel kind of entertainment that reaffirmed their power over her life. Somewhere beyond the trees, the fires of their homes burned brightly, their laughter carried faintly in the night air. They did not think of her as she lay trembling on the damp ground. They believed she was already broken, her spirit fractured beyond repair. But within her, the storm of pain began to carve something unexpected. As her body weakened, her mind grew sharper, clearer. The cold that seeped into her skin forced her to notice every sensation: the roughness of bark beneath her hand, the pulse of the earth beneath her body, the whisper of wind through the branches. Hunger honed her awareness, making every sound louder, every scent stronger, every shift in the air more vivid. Fear, though overwhelming, became a teacher, forcing her to stay alert, to distinguish between the harmless rustle of leaves and the true dangers lurking in the dark. She realized as the hours dragged on, that her pain was not simply an enemy, it was shaping her. Each wave of suffering demanded something from her, and each time she endured, something inside her grew more resilient. When her stomach cramped and twisted, she bit down hard and breathed through the pain. When the cold made her teeth chatter so violently it hurt, she focused on her heartbeat, steady and unyielding, a rhythm that reminded her she was still alive. When fear threatened to suffocate her, she forced her eyes open, staring into the shadows until she could tell the difference between illusion and reality. It would have been easier to collapse, to give in to despair, to let the night consume her. That was what the villagers expected. But lying there, shivering and starving, she began to see their cruelty differently. Their abandonment was not proof of her weakness, but of their fear. If she were truly worthless, why had they taken such measures to cast her out, to silence her? What power did they believe she held that made them so desperate to erase her? The thought planted itself in her mind like a seed, fragile yet persistent, and it gave her strength. The moon shifted in the sky, climbing higher, marking the slow passage of time. Hours crawled by, but still she endured. Each moment that passed without her breaking was a small victory, though no one else could see it. Her endurance became her rebellion. Though her body was frail, her spirit refused to bend. She began to understand that pain, while consuming, was also a forge. It stripped away illusions, sharpened her senses, and left only what was essential. She thought of the villagers who laughed at her suffering, of the family who had turned their backs, and instead of despair, a quiet determination took root. They thought this night would destroy her, but she knew now that it was creating something new within her, something unshakable. Her body might bear the scars of this suffering, but her mind was learning to endure, to wait, to sharpen itself like a blade in the fire of agony. As dawn crept closer, painting the horizon with the faintest hints of gray, she was still alive, still breathing, still unbroken. The pain had not vanished, it still gnawed, still clawed, still chilled her to the core, but it no longer owned her. It was part of her, a weight she carried not as a burden but as proof. The villagers had abandoned her to break her, but instead, they had unwittingly taught her the most dangerous lesson: how to endure until the time was right. And in her endurance, she began to glimpse the faint outline of strength, a strength that would one day make her more than they had ever imagined. The night pressed upon her like an unyielding weight, heavy with silence yet alive with something she could not name. Her body was weak from exhaustion, her stomach hollow from hunger, but her mind refused to collapse into the despair her clan had wished upon her. At first, she thought the sounds she heard were tricks of her fading strength: the wind groaning through the trees, the far-off hoot of an owl, the hiss of night creatures slipping through the underbrush. Yet the longer she sat in that silence, trembling with cold, the more she realized the whispers were not from the world outside, but from something stirring deep within. They were not the cruel jeers of her family who had cast her out, nor the indifferent sounds of nature. These voices carried meaning, rhythm, and familiarity, like echoes of a language she had always known but never learned. At first, the voices were faint, fleeting as the brush of air against her ear. She turned her head sharply, thinking perhaps someone from the village had followed her, but the shadows held no figures, no watchful eyes. Then the whispers grew stronger, threading together into murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere: the earth, the air, and her very blood. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound lived inside her. It was then she realized they were not strangers' voices at all. They felt like family, like grandmothers and great-grandfathers whose names had long been buried with the dust. Their tones were heavy with age, carrying both sorrow and strength, and though she could not see them, she felt them draw closer, circling her like a fire's warmth. "You are not abandoned," one voice said, firm and low, resonating through her bones rather than her ears. You are the key they feared, another whispered, softer but filled with unshakable certainty. They left you here to break, a third intoned, but it is here you will rise. The girl's heart pounded as if it wanted to break free from her chest. She looked to the trees, to the darkness, to the emptiness that surrounded her. Her voice trembled when she finally dared to speak, asking the shadows, "Who are you?" The whispers swelled together like a chorus, answering not in names but in truths. "We are the ones who came before you. We are the blood you carry, the strength buried in silence. You hear us because the night has stripped you bare of all lies. You hear us because suffering has made you ready." Her breath caught in her throat, and she curled her arms around herself. All her life she had been hidden, silenced, shamed, told she was nothing. Yet here, in the place meant for her destruction, she was being told the opposite. These voices did not dismiss her pain, nor did they offer shallow comfort. They ignited something inside her. Her tears, once shed in hopelessness, now carried the sting of awakening. As she listened, the voices began to shift, no longer only telling her of her worth, but urging her toward something greater. They spoke of power she had not yet touched, power waiting in the marrow of her bones and the fire of her spirit. They told her that endurance was not the end of her suffering but the beginning of her strength. Her hunger was not a curse but a sharpening. Her fear was not weakness, but the hammer that would forge courage. Every ache in her body, every shiver in her skin, was chiseling away at who she had been, revealing someone far stronger beneath. Visions flickered before her eyes, as if the whispers had opened a doorway in her mind. She saw herself standing not as the girl cast aside, but as a figure wrapped in authority. She saw villagers bowing their heads, their fear mingling with awe. She saw fire in her hands, not the kind that burned wood, but a fire that consumed lies and shattered cruelty. She saw her stepmother's face pale with shock, her father's authority crumble, and the clan's old ways scattering like dust in the wind. At first she thought it was only imagination, a desperate dream to shield her from despair. But the voices insisted, "This is not dream, it is truth waiting." They spoke of the bloodline she belonged to, one that had once commanded respect and fear, but had been hidden by those who resented its strength. They spoke of her being the last vessel of that fire, and that it was her suffering, this night of abandonment, that had unlocked what others had tried to bury. Her body trembled, not from cold this time but from the force of something awakening. It was as though the whispers were lighting torches inside her veins, filling her with heat that refused to die. She lifted her hands and for the briefest moment thought she saw faint glimmers, sparks, like embers of a flame that had been smothered but not extinguished. She gasped, but the voices only murmured in unison, "Do not fear it. It is yours. It always was." The longer she sat with the whispers, the more her fear melted into resolve. She understood now why she had been silenced, why she had been cast out. It was never about her weakness. It was always about her strength, strength so feared it had to be buried. But nothing buried forever stays hidden. The night, once her enemy, now felt like her ally, cloaking her in secrecy as her power stirred awake. The cold, once her tormentor, now hardened her body like tempered steel. The hunger, once her punishment, now sharpened her will to a blade's edge. By the time the whispers faded into silence, the girl was no longer the same as when she had been cast into the darkness. She was raw, remade, and ready. She had not been abandoned at all, she had been awakened. And though the village slept in ignorance, dreaming of her death, Dawn would not find the same broken child they had left. Dawn would find someone transformed, carrying voices and secrets that would scorch every lie ever spoken about her. The night had not yet lifted, but something within her had shifted beyond recognition. She sat in the same place where despair had once weighed her down, yet her body no longer trembled with weakness. Instead, a steady warmth spread through her, as if a fire smoldered beneath her skin. The cold air pressed around her, sharp and biting, yet she felt it less and less. Her breath no longer rose in shaky clouds. It was deep, controlled, almost measured. She touched her arms, expecting to find them chilled, but they were warm, unnaturally so, as though heat radiated from within. It startled her, yet comforted her too, for it meant she was no longer at the mercy of the night. Something was protecting her from it. When she lifted her head, her eyes caught the faint reflection of starlight in a puddle nearby. What she saw made her heart stutter. Her gaze seemed brighter, clearer than before, as though her eyes had been polished from within. They glowed faintly, not with a fire that could be seen from afar, but with a sharp clarity that pierced the shadows. Shapes in the dark became crisp, movements in the distance easy to follow. Where before the night had cloaked everything in confusion, now it unfolded itself before her as though she had always belonged to it. She could see paths between the trees, the smallest shifts of wind stirring leaves, and even the delicate breath of the earth rising from the soil. Her body hummed with sensations she could not explain. A thrum pulsed through her veins, subtle at first, then stronger, like the beat of hidden drums. It was as if rivers of force moved inside her, flowing faster than blood, carrying something ancient and powerful that she had never known was hers. She clenched her fists, and the pulse answered, surging up her arms in waves that made her skin tingle and her muscles feel sharper, stronger. When she inhaled, it felt as if the air itself bent toward her, filling her chest not only with breath but with a strange energy that refused to leave her hollow. The warmth spread outward, no longer confined to her skin but reaching into the ground beneath her. She pressed her palms against the earth and felt a vibration, a faint rhythm as if the soil itself was alive and responding to her touch. For a fleeting moment she sensed something vast, roots of trees, the slow heartbeat of the land, even the whisper of water buried deep below. The connection startled her and she snatched her hands back, yet the sensation remained, echoing inside her veins. She thought of the voices she had heard earlier, their whispers of power and awakening. This must be what they meant. Her suffering had opened the door, and now her body was crossing its threshold. Fear tried to creep into her mind, but it could not find ground to root itself in. Instead, curiosity filled her, mingled with awe. She flexed her fingers again, and though there was no visible flame or light, she knew something had changed forever. She was no longer simply flesh and blood. She was becoming more, something infused with the spirit of those who had come before, something the village had tried to silence because they had feared it. The signs would not be hidden forever. Already she knew that if anyone saw her now, they would notice the strange glow in her eyes, the unshakable calm in her body, the warmth that clung to her even in the coldest night. But she did not shrink from that thought. For the first time she welcomed it. The marks of awakening were no curse. They were proof that she was not abandoned, not broken, not forgotten. She was chosen. She was rising. And soon the village would see it too. The night she was cast aside, the village glowed with firelight and pulsed with laughter. Drums echoed through the air, their deep rhythms carrying joy across the fields, while the smell of roasted meat drifted thickly from the center of the gathering. Smoke curled upward, blending with the stars, and voices rose in song, praising the ancestors, praising abundance, praising everything except the girl they had abandoned. For them, this night was not one of mourning but of celebration. Her suffering was not tragedy, it was entertainment, a cruel story that gave them something to gossip about between bites of food. Children darted between the legs of the elders, their mouths sticky with fruit, their bellies full of rich broth. Men sat in circles, tearing flesh from bones, smearing fat across their fingers as they spoke of harvests and hunts. Women poured gourds of beer, their bracelets clinking as they laughed, their eyes shining with malice when her name was spoken. It was as though her exile had become the evening's amusement, a spice added to their food, a joke that made the ale sweeter. Some mimicked her voice, shrill and pitiful, calling for mercy. Others cackled and bent their backs, pretending to stagger weakly as she had when her stepmother had pushed her from the homestead. Even the children picked up the cruelty, chasing each other in circles, shouting her name and falling to the ground in exaggerated cries of hunger. Each act of mockery drew another burst of laughter, as if their own joy required her humiliation to shine brighter. The stepmother herself sat tall, her head wrapped in vibrant cloth, her hands heavy with rings. She was the queen of this performance, the conductor of their derision. Each time she lifted her cup, voices hushed, waiting for her next declaration. She spoke loudly of the girl's weakness, claiming that no child cursed by the spirits could ever rise above fate. She told the villagers that hiding her away had been mercy enough, that casting her into the night was the final justice she deserved. The crowd cheered at her words, eager to flatter the woman who had orchestrated the suffering they now fed upon. Plates of yam and cassava were passed around, calabashes filled again and again. Firelight flickered across faces glistening with sweat and satisfaction. Their laughter rose like a storm, drowning out the silence where the girl once lived among them. Not one among them spared her a thought of pity. They believed hunger would gnaw her down to bone. They believed the cold would break her before morning. They believed she was already defeated, and their feast was proof of their triumph. Yet even in their revelry, shadows lingered at the edges of the celebration. A few younger villagers glanced uneasily toward the dark hills, where the girl had been left. Their laughter faltered for a heartbeat, but fear of the stepmother kept them silent. They swallowed their doubts with mouthfuls of food, convincing themselves that no one abandoned could survive. Still, the drums pounded louder and the songs grew bolder. The feast was a declaration: she was nothing, they were everything. The meat was torn apart as if her body itself had been conquered. The beer splashed onto the earth as though sealing her fate. They reveled as if morning would bring only her disappearance from memory. What none of them knew was that their mockery had reached her even in the silence of her exile. Every burst of laughter across the wind, every song sung in cruelty, every cheer that echoed through the night, it all carried to her like fuel. They believed they were writing her ending, but in truth, they were feeding the fire of her beginning. While they celebrated her weakness, they unknowingly forged her strength. By morning, the feast they thought victorious would be remembered not for joy but for irony, for the girl they mocked was already changing, already awakening, already preparing to return as the master of the village they thought she had lost forever. The night dragged on, but as the last embers of the villagers' feast smoldered and the stars dimmed against the promise of dawn, the girl stirred. Where once her body had been curled in pain, shaking with cold and weakness, now it straightened with a calm that startled even herself. Her limbs felt no longer heavy but alive, charged with something that moved beneath her skin like fire and river combined. She rose slowly, each movement deliberate, each breath drawing in more than air. It drew strength from the earth itself. The ground beneath her feet no longer seemed hostile. Instead, it hummed as though answering her presence. The soil, hard and cold through the night, softened under her steps, almost guiding her forward. The air, which once bit at her skin with sharp winds, now flowed warmly around her, bending and circling as though to shield her. The darkness that had been her prison shifted into an ally, wrapping her in silence that pulsed with hidden energy. Her back, once stooped with exhaustion, stood tall. Her eyes, tired and dim hours before, now burned with an unnatural clarity, glowing faintly as though reflecting the first fire of the morning sun. Her heart, which had felt brittle from sorrow, beat with steady thunder, each pulse announcing that she was no longer a victim of cruelty but something reborn from it. She stretched her arms wide, and the air seemed to move with her, rustling the leaves and whispering in a language older than words. As she took her first steps, the memories of hunger and humiliation no longer broke her spirit, they sharpened it. Every cruelty that had been thrown at her returned not as wounds but as fuel. The laughter of the villagers from the night before echoed in her ears, but instead of tearing her down, it solidified her resolve. They had mocked her weakness, but it was that very weakness that had birthed this strength. The sky above her began to lighten, a faint streak of gold breaking the horizon. With each inch of rising sun, her own transformation deepened. She felt as though she rose with the dawn, her spirit tethered to the light that spilled across the land. Birds stirred from their nests, their cries sharper, as if acknowledging her presence. The wind carried the scent of ash from the village feast, yet it no longer smelled of defeat. It smelled like the remnants of a world about to change. She lifted her chin and looked toward the village. The hut stood quietly in the distance, unaware of what approached with the coming day. Her stepmother, sleeping on her bed of pride and arrogance, knew nothing of the storm that had been born in the night. The villagers, their bellies heavy with stolen joy, would awaken to find that what they had abandoned had not vanished but had returned with power greater than any of them could comprehend. Each stride forward felt like the earth itself bent to her, pushing her onward, honoring her rise. The air curled at her back as though carrying her forward. She was no longer just a girl. She was the embodiment of endurance turned to strength, silence turned to voice, suffering turned to command. And as the horizon flamed with the sun's first fire, so too did she rise, her figure glowing, her spirit unbreakable. Before dawn had fully claimed the sky, she was no longer the forsaken child they had left to die. She was the master of her own fate and soon the master of the village that thought they had erased her. She walked into the village as the sun began to climb, its golden light trailing behind her as though it had chosen her alone to illuminate. The dirt path was the same one she had been dragged down when she was cast out, but now each step she took pressed deeper into the earth, steady and deliberate, echoing like a drumbeat that carried into the hearts of those who saw her return. Villagers stirred from their sleep, some still heavy from the night's feast, rubbing their eyes as they caught sight of her figure cutting through the morning haze. At first, whispers ran through the crowd, disbelief that she had survived the night, disbelief that she dared to return. Then came the mocking voices, sharp and cruel, the same voices that had always risen against her. They laughed, calling her cursed, weak and foolish, declaring that she should have remained in the darkness where she belonged. But their laughter faltered when she did not bow her head as she once had, did not shrink into the shadows they had forced her into. Instead, she walked taller, her posture unbending, her eyes glowing with a light that unsettled even the boldest among them. Her silence was not weakness but weight, pressing down on the air like a gathering storm. One by one, the voices that mocked her broke into uneasy quiet. Children tugged at their mother's arms, whispering that her eyes looked strange, that she seemed more than human. The men who had always scoffed at her strength shifted on their feet, as if the ground itself had grown unsteady beneath them. She reached the village square, where the ashes of the feast fires still smoldered. There she stopped, standing tall before them all. The silence deepened. The villagers found themselves staring, unable to look away, caught between fear and fascination. It was as though the morning had split in two, the light of the rising sun above them and the darker, more powerful light radiating from her below it. Her presence pressed into their chests, made their breaths shallow as though unseen hands held them in place. No one dared step forward. Her stepmother emerged from her hut, drawn by the murmurs and the stillness that had overtaken the village. At first, she wore her usual sneer, confident that whatever strength the girl thought she carried would crumble before her authority. She raised her voice, mocking as always, reminding the people of the story she had spun for years, that the girl was nothing, cursed, an example of failure that should never be followed. Some villagers gave nervous chuckles, clinging to the old lies like a shield. But the girl did not flinch, did not lower her gaze. She stared at her stepmother with a steady intensity that burned more than any insult. The villagers noticed it too. The stepmother's words no longer held the same power they once did. Each insult she hurled seemed to hang weakly in the air, dissipating like smoke against the weight of the girl's silence. The crowd, which had always nodded along with her cruelty, now shifted uneasily, their eyes moving from the stepmother to the girl and back again. Doubt spread like wildfire through them and with it, fear. Then the girl finally spoke. Her voice was calm but carried like thunder, reaching every ear in the square. She did not waste words on anger or revenge. Instead, she spoke of what she had endured, of the darkness they had left her in, of the suffering they had mocked. Her words were not pleas for pity but statements of truth, undeniable and heavy. She told them how every cruelty had not broken her but built her, how every moment of hunger and pain had sharpened her spirit until she had become what stood before them now. The villagers' hearts pounded as they listened, their shame growing heavier with each word. The stepmother tried to interrupt, her voice sharp and desperate, but her protests sounded thin, almost hollow, as though even she no longer believed them. The girl's voice cut through her lies, exposing them to the light of morning. She declared that she was no longer their victim, no longer their outcast, but the force that had risen from what they thought would destroy her. A hush fell so deep it seemed the entire world had paused. The villagers looked upon her not as the broken child they had once mocked but as something larger, something powerful, something they had created with their own cruelty but could no longer control. Fear tightened their throats, awe widened their eyes. The stepmother, for the first time, trembled. Her authority, once absolute, began to crumble in the presence of the girl who now commanded the very air around them. What had begun with laughter ended in silence, and in that silence, the village understood. The girl had returned not as a beggar for their acceptance, but as the master of the truth they had tried to bury. And truth, once spoken, carried a fire no one could extinguish. She stood in the center of the village square, the air around her so heavy it seemed to silence even the rustling of the trees. The ashes of the feast fire still glowed faintly, smoke curling upward as though bearing witness to what was about to unfold. Her eyes swept across the crowd, pausing on those who had laughed the loudest at her suffering, the ones who had led others in mocking her, the ones who had taken pleasure in her pain. Her gaze cut through them like a blade, leaving them squirming where they stood, unable to meet her stare. For the first time in their lives they felt small before her. Her voice rose, not loud but sharp and unyielding. She named them one by one, calling out their cruelty before the entire village. The woman who had once thrown stones at her for amusement, the man who had spat on her when she begged for water, the youths who had dragged her through the mud and laughed as she cried. Each name she spoke was like a drumbeat, reverberating through the square, echoing in the hearts of the listeners. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling among them, shame burning their faces as the truth was laid bare for all to hear. The guilty tried to defend themselves, stammering excuses, saying they had only followed what others had done, that they had not meant harm. But their voices faltered as the girl's eyes fixed on them, glowing faintly with a strange light. The whispers she had once heard in the darkness now seemed to pour through her, guiding her words, filling them with power that could not be denied. She raised her hand and the air grew heavy. A gust of wind swept through the square though the morning had been still, stirring the ashes of the feast fire until sparks danced in the air like fiery insects. Gasps rose from the villagers as they stepped back, realizing that the forces of the world themselves seemed to bend to her will. Those who had mocked her most harshly felt the weight first. The proud woman who had led the gossip about her sank to her knees, clutching her chest as though unseen hands pressed down upon her. The man who had once shouted curses at her stumbled backward, his legs trembling until he fell into the dirt before her. The youths who had tormented her cried out, dropping their heads to the ground, their voices breaking as they begged for forgiveness. The entire square seemed to shift, the balance of power turning before their eyes. The girl who had been nothing in their eyes now stood above them all, and they bowed, not out of choice but out of necessity, as though some great force demanded their submission. Her stepmother watched in horror, her face paling as she realized that this was no act, no trick. The villagers who once hung on her every word now looked past her, their attention fixed on the girl who commanded the morning itself. Fear twisted the stepmother's features, but still she tried to hold her ground, raising her voice in protest. Yet her words sounded weak and desperate, drowned out by the cries of those who had already bowed. The girl spoke again, her words steady, resonant, as though she had become the mouthpiece of something far greater. She told them that cruelty had always been their weakness, that their pride had blinded them, that they had mistaken mockery for strength when true strength was survival, endurance, and truth. She declared that no lie could stand against what she had become. Every insult, every act of violence, every moment of hunger had forged her spirit until it was unbreakable. And now before them all, the truth demanded to be seen. The villagers trembled, many pressing their foreheads into the dirt, unable to look upon her. Even those who had not mocked her openly felt the weight of their silence, their failure to defend her. The proud had fallen, stripped of their arrogance, brought low before the one they had once despised. It was not just fear that held them down, it was the realization that the balance of power had shifted forever. For the first time she was not the girl they had hidden, mocked, or starved. She was the one who had survived everything meant to destroy her, the one who now commanded the respect they had always denied her. And as they bowed before her, one truth settled into every heart. The proud had fallen and she had risen, not with vengeance but with the undeniable force of someone who had mastered pain and turned it into power. The dawn broke with a hush that seemed unnatural for the village. Where there was usually the sound of roosters crowing and early fires crackling, there was silence, as if the very air had paused in anticipation. The villagers, who only the night before had raised their voices in laughter and drunken song while mocking her suffering, now stirred uneasily. Whispers traveled faster than the morning light. She had returned. She had walked through the night of exile, through the hunger, the cold, the whispers of spirits, and she had not fallen. Instead, she had risen, stronger than any had imagined. And now she stood at the edge of the village square, her figure outlined against the rising sun, every movement a statement of power. At first, the boldest of the proud tried to raise their voices against her, clinging to the illusion that nothing had changed. They spoke mockingly, urging others to laugh, but their words trembled and the laughter never came. The weight of her gaze silenced them, for it carried the fire of a night endured and powers awakened. She had suffered in the shadows, and now the shadows seemed to follow her, thickening around her like a cloak. Even the elders, who had condoned her abandonment, found their eyes dropping when she looked upon them. They could not face her. The balance had shifted. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not need to. Her voice, calm and steady, cut through the silence like a blade. She named each cruelty she had endured, recounting the betrayals, the lies, the abandonment. Her words fell like heavy stones upon the square, impossible to ignore. And with each truth she spoke, those who had once laughed felt themselves shrinking, their pride stripped away, their masks of authority burning under the fire of her return. Some wept quietly, realizing the weight of their cruelty. Others trembled, sensing forces far older and deeper moving through her, as though the ancestors themselves stood behind her, speaking through her breath. When she called out the worst among them, the proudest voices of scorn, the air itself seemed to turn against them. They faltered, collapsing under the pressure of her presence, as if unseen hands pressed them into the dust. The crowd watched in awe as the once mighty bowed without willing it, their knees trembling and their heads lowering to the earth. No one forced them, no weapon was raised, yet none could resist. The girl they had cast aside had become something more than human in their eyes. She was proof of a truth they had denied, that cruelty could not kill what was destined to rise. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers' awe grew into reverence. They no longer looked at her as the girl they had left to suffer. They looked at her as the master of the morning, the one who had conquered night itself. Mothers held their children closer, whispering warnings to remember her name. Men who once laughed now bent their heads, offering their loyalty in silence. Even the elders, who had governed the rhythms of life for so long, bowed to her, acknowledging that their authority had been shattered by the force of her endurance and transformation. By morning the shift was complete. No one dared question her place. The same square where they had once mocked her became the ground where they now swore their respect and obedience. Fear mingled with awe, but beyond both was something stronger: recognition. They saw her not as a victim but as their new leader, one who had faced death, darkness, and the weight of cruelty, and emerged not broken but unshakable. Her mastery was not born of titles or inheritance, but of survival, truth, and fire. The girl who had been cast out had returned as the master of the village. Her story was no longer whispered in scorn but spoken with trembling respect. And though some feared her, all understood that they now lived under the watch of a power they could never again bury or deny. She had been left to suffer, but by morning she stood above them all, unforgettable, undeniable, unhidden. As the years passed, her story did not fade, it only grew brighter, retold in every corner of the land. Children heard it first from their mothers, who whispered the tale by firelight, their voices low but filled with awe. The girl who was left to suffer, the girl the village had cast out, the girl who should have perished in the night. But she had not. She had risen before the sun, stronger than the cruelty that tried to bury her, and by morning she ruled the very people who had mocked her. In time, no one called her by the name she had carried as a child. That name, too small for what she had become, was buried with the past. Instead, she was remembered as the Master of Dawn, the one who walked from the darkness carrying fire in her veins and truth in her voice. Her exile became the foundation of her strength, and the cold night that was meant to break her turned into the night that awakened her. The villagers who once laughed at her absence never forgot the moment their laughter died in their throats, silenced by her presence. They taught their children and their grandchildren never to mock the suffering of another, for the one who is cast aside may carry power greater than any can imagine. And whenever disputes arose, people would ask, what would the Master of Dawn do? Her endurance became a measure of wisdom, her triumph a reminder of the balance between cruelty and justice. Travelers carried her story beyond the borders of her village, retelling it in distant markets and foreign lands. To some she was a warning: do not betray the innocent, for they may rise as your judge. To others she was an inspiration: no matter how deep the night, no matter how bitter the suffering, there lies a dawn when strength awakens. Her name became a proverb, her memory a shield for those who endured hardship, and her voice lived on in the songs of wandering griots who wove her tale into the fabric of legend. The village itself transformed under her reign. Where there had once been arrogance and cruelty, there was now reverence and restraint. The people, having seen how power could shift with the breaking of a single dawn, learned humility. They treated the weak with care, the stranger with respect, and the outcast with caution, for they remembered that in one girl whom they had left to die, the entire order of their world had been overturned. Generations later, when her face was no longer remembered, her spirit remained. The fire of her endurance became a symbol that lit countless lives. And though time blurred the details, the heart of the story never changed. They left her to suffer, but she returned stronger than the night itself. She became master of those who had cast her out, her triumph rising with the sun, eternal as the dawn. Thus she passed from memory into legend, not as a victim but as a force of truth and fire. And so long as the sun continued to rise over the village, her story rose with it, whispered in the morning air, carried in the rustle of leaves, alive in every flame. The girl they tried to destroy became the legend who proved that no darkness could hold back the light of one who is destined to rise.